Alright, class, today we're going to talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. So since we're doing more logic, I'm using the webcam and I'm using notebook paper instead of a PowerPoint because I think having me actually write some of this stuff in as we go will be a little easier to follow. First and foremost, though, although necessary and sufficient conditions are part of logic, they're doing something very, very different than when we were talking about arguments. And so, big picture, what's the difference? Arguments, in a sense, relate statements, relate facts, etc. So, the premises lead to the conclusion, those are all statements. Necessary and sufficient conditions relate things. For instance, what is the relationship between tiger and animal? Or Mickey and philosopher? That. So, these are relating things. Second of all, notice they are relations. So there's no such thing as sufficient generally. There is A is sufficient for B. So it always relates between two things. It's like saying taller than. You can't just say one by themselves. So I've put the precise definitions and then kind of a crude generalization for both of them. A is sufficient for B if membership in A guarantees membership in B. So you could think of a sufficient condition as a logical guarantee. What kinds of things are logical guarantees? And we'll look more closely at this later. Well, things like examples and subclasses are logical guarantees. So let's just give three quick examples. I'm going to give some examples now, and then we're going to go and look much more precisely at how to determine these. So what's an example of a logical guarantee? Well, getting caught plagiarizing is a sufficient condition for failing the course. One guarantees the other. Being Mickey, this guy, is a sufficient condition for being a philosopher. Mickey is an example of a philosopher. Or for subclasses, being a dog is a sufficient condition for being a mammal. So those are three examples you might want to write down because we'll return to them later. So getting caught plagiarizing is sufficient for failing the course. Being Mickey is a sufficient condition for being a philosopher. Being a dog is a sufficient condition for being a mammal. The other logical relation is necessary conditions. So X is necessary for Y if one cannot be a member of Y without also being a member of X. So approximately what's that saying? It's a requirement. It's a logical requirement. One must be the case for the other to be the case. So what's an example of a logical requirement? There's one on your syllabus. Taking all the exams is a necessary condition for passing the course. Taking all the exams is a necessary condition for passing the course. A couple of other things can be necessary conditions. Supertype. You don't hear that very often, but it's basically the opposite of a subclass. So being an animal is a necessary condition for being a tiger. Being an animal is a necessary condition for being a tiger. The last thing is interesting, the part of relation. This could be the part of in a very literal sense. So having a heart is a necessary condition for being a human. But they can also run more kind of abstract or conceptual. So think of Russell's definition of philosophy. Pursuing truth is necessary for doing philosophy. That's part of his definition. So that's what these things are, really big picture. The more important thing, though, is how to determine them and how we use them. So let's next turn to how we determine them. So first of all, this is a procedure. Logic is procedure. You follow the procedure correctly 100% of the time, you get the correct answer 100% of the time. You don't follow the procedure, you're guessing. So what's the procedure? First of all, we're going to do a setup. We're going to set it up as 1 is a blank condition for 2. So that's the setup. When you're doing examples on the discussion boards and such, make sure you set it up correctly or you can't really do these. But to answer this, we actually ask 2 questions. First, we are going to ask, are all, not most, all cases of 1 cases of 2? Simple yes/no question. And if yes, 1 is sufficient for 2. If no, 1 is not sufficient for 2. So notice question 1 only establishes sufficiency. It doesn't say anything about necessity. So next, we flip it. Our second question is, are all cases of 2 cases of 1? And so note, really important, we change the order. You change the order unintentionally and you will get the wrong answer. So, but it's very deliberate here because this is our second question. And now we say, if yes, then 1 is necessary for 2. And if no, 1 is not necessary for 2. And so notice, because we have 2 questions with 2 different answers, we are actually at a point where there are 4 possible responses. We can answer yes, 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 no, no, yes, no, no. And we're going to do all those examples we just did in a moment, but I want to say what the answers signify, and this really starts leading into, well, why does all of this matter? Sorry, I let the autofocus go. Maybe I won't. It'll focus as soon as I start writing. So all of life has just become a multiple choice question. Take any 2 things in the universe, or the multiverse really, and one of the following 4 will obtain. If you'd like, you can call them A, B, C, and D. Just don't get too hung up on that in case they appear in a different order of the exam. So 2 things could be related as sufficient but not necessary. And this is what happens when we answer yes, no. And all 3 of the cases I already gave you are going to be sufficient, not necessary. That is the logical guarantee, examples, and subclasses. And I'll show you why. Let's just return back to this. So, first of all, we set it up correctly. Suppose I didn't already know the answer, and I was trying to determine what the relationship is between getting caught plagiarizing and failing the course. First, I set it up correctly. I say, getting caught plagiarizing is a blank condition for failing the course. Well, are all cases of getting caught plagiarizing cases of failing the course? Yep, as per the syllabus, F for the course, report to the Dean of Students. But that only tells us about sufficiency. So now we have to flip it and ask, are all cases of failing the course cases of plagiarizing? No, if you do terribly on all the exams, you fail as well, which means we answered yes to the first question, no to the second, and that's why a logical guarantee is sufficient but not necessary. The next one I did, being Mickey, this guy, is a blank condition for being a philosopher. So that's our example. So first of all, I always say this guy, not to be cute, but just to emphasize that I'm talking about myself rather than anybody named Mickey. So, are all cases of Mickey, this guy, cases of being a philosopher? Yes, trivially, because there's only one case of this guy, and he is in fact a philosopher. However, then we flip it. Are all cases of philosophers cases of Mickey? Nope. We've already encountered Bertrand Russell and Socrates, plenty of philosophers who are not Mickey. So we've answered yes, no, and that's what will always happen with examples. So examples are sufficient, not necessary. Third was the subclass. Something very similar happens. First of all, if we didn't know the answer, we'd have to set it up correctly. Being a dog is a blank condition for being a mammal. Being a dog is a blank condition for being a mammal. Are all cases of dogs cases of mammals? Yep, sure are. But then we flip it and we ask, are all cases of mammals cases of dogs? No, there's lots of other mammals. There's bats and chinchillas and humans and all sorts of stuff. So we answered yes, no, and that'll always happen with subclasses, so subclasses are sufficient, not necessary. All right. So notice we've already talked a little bit about what happens in category A here of sufficient, not necessary. But let me say something else. First of all, on the exam, etc., you're not responsible for telling me whether it's an example, a subclass, anything like that. You're just responsible for providing the answer of sufficient, not necessary. But just like with the logic examples, the reason I give the extra is because, this is not focusing, there you go. It's because if I recognize something as a subclass, then I automatically know it's sufficient, not necessary without doing the rest of the test. So either way is fine as long as you get the correct answer. So now we will turn to necessary, but not sufficient. This is the answer you get when you answer no, comma, yes. So no to the first question, yes to the second. And these are the three examples of necessary I gave before. So there's a logical requirement. There's supertype. And there's part of. And so let's once more just go through those three examples as we would if we didn't know the answer already and we were doing the test. So we do the setup. Now if I got to remember my examples. Taking all the exams is a blank condition for passing the course. Are all cases of taking the exams cases of passing the course? No, if you do really terribly on all the exams, you still won't pass. So we answer no to the first question, so it's not sufficient. But then we flip it. Are all cases of passing the course cases of taking all the exams? Yes. Why? It's a logical requirement. So logical requirements, we'll always answer no, yes, hence necessary, not sufficient. And get in the habit of doing that, by the way. Don't just say necessary. That's half an answer. Say necessary, not sufficient. Next one, the supertype. What the world was my example of the supertype? Being an animal. Being an animal is a blank condition for being a tiger. Are all cases of animals cases of tigers? Of course not. So it's not sufficient. Being an animal doesn't guarantee you're a tiger. Are all cases of being a tiger cases of being an animal? Yes. So it's necessary. So hence, being an animal is necessary but not sufficient for being a tiger. That will always happen with supertypes. And so that gives us answer B. Last one was the part of having a heart is a blank condition for being a human. Are all things with hearts humans? Cases of humans? No, of course not. Lots of other things have hearts. So it's not sufficient. However, we flip it. Are all cases of humans things with hearts? Yes. Having a heart is part of being a human. Could be very literal, but again, we could also be more conceptual with the part of. So being rational might be necessary but not sufficient for being a human. Who knows? But let's go back to the Russell one. Pursuing truth is a blank condition for doing philosophy. For Russell, are all cases of pursuing truth cases of doing philosophy? No. Botanists pursue truth. Astronomers pursue truth, etc. Lots of ways to pursue truth. Are all cases of doing philosophy cases of pursuing truth? Yes, for Russell. So necessary, not sufficient, because that's part of his definition of philosophy. So again, the part of relation will always yield necessary, not sufficient. All right, what about the other two categories? And this is why we're getting into why it matters. So neither necessary nor sufficient is what happens when we answer no, no. If you pick any two random things, this will probably be the answer. That just means no logical relationship. And I'm going to do two different ones there. So suppose I gave you, start with an easy one. Being a pirate is a blank condition for being a ninja. Being a pirate is a blank condition for being a ninja. Are all cases of pirates cases of ninjas? No, of course not, so it's not sufficient. Are all cases of ninjas cases of pirates? Still no, of course not, so it isn't necessary either. So that's just no relationship at all. There's just not a relationship between pirates and ninjas. By contrast, try this one. And really, if you want to try it, hit the pause button. Being tall is a blank condition for being a professional basketball player. Being tall is a blank condition for being a professional basketball player. Are all cases of tall people cases of professional basketball players? No, of course not. Major league pitchers are pretty tall too. A lot of non-athletes are tall. So we answered no, it's not sufficient. Are all cases of professional basketball players cases of tall people? Careful. And this is why I say it has to be all. If you say most, that's not a logical relationship. That's what we might call a statistical relationship. Or even an inductive relationship. You're more likely to be tall if you're in the NBA. But it's certainly not a requirement. Muggsy Malone was a very famous not-so-tall basketball player. And so no relationship, not logical relationship, of course, follows here, but remember that statistical relationships are not logical relationships either. All right, we're now getting to why all of this stuff matters and why it's in this unit. What kind of things are both necessary and sufficient? That is, what kind of things would you answer yes, yes? There's really three kinds of things here. The least important one at the moment is identity. So this could be a very, very blatant case of identity, like being Mickey is sufficient for being, being Mickey is a blank condition for being Mickey. Is being Mickey a case of being Mickey? Yes. Is being Mickey a case of Mickey? Yes. But more interesting cases of identities are things like being Sacramento is a blank condition for being the capital of California. There, if you do it, go ahead and try. You'll get yes, yes. So those are the least interesting ones at the moment. They're important in other fields, but not for our purposes here. Much more importantly, good definitions and essences. All right. So, what's the difference between these? Definitions are linguistic, essences are real or existent somehow. So, here's a definition of essence. The essence of a thing is what makes a thing what it is. And that might sound cutesy or confusing, but it's really not. So the essence of human or humanity is whatever makes a human, something we talk about a lot in philosophy. The essence of justice is whatever makes a just act just, etc., etc. So we are very interested in essences in philosophy because if there are facts about what makes a human, those are very important and they go well beyond a mere definition. However, we must describe this essence in words, so essences, when kind of translated to language, become good definitions. But if we go back to our test, there's an example of a good definition. Being a regular quadrilateral is a blank condition for being a square. Being a regular quadrilateral is a blank condition for being a square. If you don't know what those words mean, feel free to pause and look them up. Are all cases of regular quadrilaterals cases of squares? Yes, so it's sufficient. Are all cases of squares cases of regular quadrilaterals? Yes, so it's necessary. So being a regular quadrilateral is both necessary and sufficient for being a square. Now, here's the fun part. Think of what you're doing in the written assignment. You are doing a conceptual analysis where you are trying to define some key philosophical concept that would help resolve the controversy you're working on. So if, say, you're working on capital punishment and part one of the paper said, well, I need to figure out what justice is before I can figure out if capital punishment is permissible, that means part two of the paper, you're just trying to defend a good definition of justice. That is, you're trying to find necessary and sufficient conditions. And notice, we can use this method to make very sure we're actually identifying the conditions. So, for instance, if I define a human as a rational biped, are all cases of rational bipeds cases of humans? Yes. Are all cases of humans cases of rational bipeds? Actually, no, because some humans only have one leg or zero legs, and yet are still humans. And so notice, just running through this test, I realized I didn't quite define humans how I intended. And so I need to revise it a little. In this case, people will usually say a human is a rational biped by nature. So are all cases of humans cases of rational bipeds by nature? Seems to be. Are all cases of rational bipeds by nature cases of humans? Seems to be if you define rationality in the Aristotelian sense. But so we can actually, this is not window dressing. Necessary and sufficient conditions should help us analyze concepts a lot better. For instance, let me just give one more example and then we'll go back to kind of the easier examples. Here's a bad argument I've heard before. Homosexuals should not be allowed to be married because they can't produce kids. What they're really saying in that case is that not being able to have kids is sufficient for not being allowed to be married? Well, are all cases of people who are not allowed to have kids people who shouldn't be married? Sure doesn't seem like it. I feel like people over 50 should be allowed to be married. I feel like people who've had a hysterectomy should be allowed to be married, etc. And so one doesn't actually guarantee the other, which is why that's a bad inference. But let's go back to so overall, keep working on this, and it should help us with our philosophical analysis, not just on the paper, but for the rest of the semester. But for now, what you should be doing is learning it. So if you need a discussion response for today, here's 2 things you can do. Actually, 3 things. So if you want, these are really easy to make up your own cases. You just need to name 2 things. You could either give me just 10, give me the 2 things and tell me what the answer is, without explanation, or give me 5 with explanation for full credit. Or you can talk about the answers your classmates want, if they're right or wrong and why. So those are 3 things you could do for participation credit this week. But let me give you, let's just do a few examples together. I'll give you the example, and then I encourage you to pause and figure it out on your own. So, having a driver's license is a blank condition for being a good driver. Having a driver's license is a blank condition for being a good driver. Pause and do it on your own. Don't just play the nod along with Mickey game. All right. Are all cases of people with driver's licenses cases of good drivers? Absolutely not. Usually when I'm driving to Kent State branch campuses, I almost get into about 2 accidents a week almost because of other people's ineptitude. So clearly no. Are all cases of good drivers cases of people with driver's licenses? The answer is still no, because we don't just mean most, we mean all. You might be a good driver and have just forgotten to renew your license. Or here's a weird one, in the state of Ohio, you could be a great driver but lose your license if you don't pay child support, etc., etc. So the answer is no, no, because that is a statistical relationship. So if I was just giving the answer, I'd say neither necessary nor sufficient. If I was giving an explanation, I could say it in a couple of ways. I could say, well, because there are lots of people with licenses who aren't good drivers, and there are good drivers who don't have their licenses. Or I could say something like, it's neither necessary nor sufficient because it's a statistical relationship. Or I could put it, you could always put it in terms of guarantees and requirements. It is neither a requirement nor a guarantee. So that would be fine. Let's try a couple more. Being furniture is a blank condition for being a chair. Again, pause. Are all cases of furniture cases of chairs? No, of course not. So it's not sufficient. Are all cases of chairs cases of furniture? Yes. Don't try to get creative. Well, what about doll furniture? No, don't do that stuff. So we answered no, yes, because chair is a subclass of furniture, making it necessary but not sufficient. Next one. Being enrolled in this class is a blank condition for being enrolled at Kent State University. Being enrolled in this class is a blank condition for being enrolled at Kent State. Are all cases of people enrolled in this class cases of people enrolled at Kent State? Yes, even if it's, a provisional high school enrollment, you're still enrolled. So it's sufficient. Are all cases of people enrolled at Kent State University cases of people enrolled in this class? No, there are not 40,000 people in this class today, I'm glad. So we answered yes, no. It is sufficient, not necessary. You might interpret that as either a requirement or a subclass. Either one is sufficient, not necessary. All right, let's just call it a day there because I really want you to work on some of these on your own. Uh, and don't just write it on the discussion board and go away. If you are being consistently wrong, you definitely want to know about it and find out before the exam. So keep working on them. And again, just give me some of your own examples. It's very easy to make them up. If you are using an outside source, make very sure you are citing it or you have plagiarized. Otherwise, let me just say a word or two about what we're going to talk about next time. So we have, this is a mini unit on philosophical analysis. We've already did a little bit of that when we're talking about the social contract. Ooh, and if you want to get really clever, relate this material to the social contract. The next reading is a little bit of a complex one, but not if you put it in context. It's really not bad if you put it in context. So next time we are reading the Euthyphro. So this is a Middle Plato dialogue, which means we're getting Plato's own work. And but here's the thing. Plato effectively wrote this for his students at the academy, which means what's really nice about this is intended as a learning device, not as a historical dialogue, which means Plato's going to help you kind of work through a lot of the so-called kind of freshman mistakes in conceptual analysis. So what's going to happen is there's a fictitious character, Socrates, who is having a discussion with Euthyphro, and they decide, in order to resolve a controversial issue, they need to get really clear on what piety is. We don't use the word piety very much, but roughly speaking, duty to the gods, or good in a way that the gods would want, or if you'd like, just goodness is fine too. So what is the relationship there? And they are going to try to arrive at a good definition, that is, necessary and sufficient conditions. And what Plato is going to do is he's going to have Euthyphro kind of bumble through a lot of these kind of standard mistakes. So Euthyphro is going to posit 6, count them, 6 definitions of piety, and Socrates, fictional Socrates, is going to point out why all of them fail. If you want to be clever, if you really want to get the most bang for your buck, tell me why they fail in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. They're trying to get both necessary and sufficient, but each of the 6 definitions is going to end up being one of these 3 categories. So try to think of why. In addition to that, yes, it's great for conceptual analysis. It also has one of the most important thoughts in the history of ethics in it, called the Euthyphro dilemma. Make sure to Google that and really work on understanding that before you read the Euthyphro and before you watch the next lecture. Otherwise, we will see you next time.